Hola a todos, bienvenidos nuevamente al canal de la Red Cultural. Tenemos el privilegio de tener nuevamente con nosotros a Fiona Peters de la Universidad de Bath Spa. La Red Cultural es socia de la Universidad de Bath y Fiona nuevamente ha venido a Chile. De hecho, ahora estamos pensando establecer para el 2020 un simposio de crime fiction, que es lo que a ella se dedica aquí, en Santiago de Chile. Pero hoy vamos a conversar de algo que ella está investigando, que ella, o sea, en general, no solo ella, en el mundo lo ha llamado, el verdadero crimen, true crime. Hi Fiona, welcome to Red Cultural again. We're very glad to have you again in Santiago, and we will have you again next year.
Yes.
So we're very, very lucky. You are working now in a new, no, it's not a subgender into crime fiction, that it's called in true crime.
Mm-hmm.
What is true crime? What's the difference between crime fiction in general? What's this? It's reality, isn't it?
Well, in a way, no. I think that when we think about true crime, we think about something that happens, which is reported, and it's factual, and so on and so forth. But of course, in reality, when something happens, everyone has a different opinion on it, and people judge the situation. And so it's never just true. Reporting is always something that is from different perspective. So I think that what I'm really interested in is the idea of narratives of true crime, so that you can see the way, and it really narrates the way through memoir, through journals, through books, through television programs now, through podcasts and so on, especially in the age of the digital world. The ways in which true crime can be narrativized, can be made into like a story. So it becomes a part of crime fiction, I would argue. Obviously, crime fiction is where I started. I teach crime fiction primarily in a literature department on both BA and MA level and PhDs as well. And crime fiction is now the most popular genre in the world. Oh. And every year it gets more and more popular. And within that, the rise of interest in true crime is something really quite new to this kind of narrative. Obviously, it's not something that's new in terms of the public's fascination for criminals and so on. It's been going on as long as crime fiction has existed as a genre. But I think that the kind of rather bloodthirsty and voyeuristic reporting and those books back in the 70s and 80s have been now pretty much replaced by things that are much more reflective. And so therefore they're not separate, but I think that they work from each other. So that also the other thing is that true crime describes things that if you put in a novel, people wouldn't believe you. So obviously the things that people do in the real world are more extreme than a crime fiction writer can include in their novel. I started my interest in crime fiction with the writing of Patricia Highsmith, and I was fascinated with her character, and I still am, with her character Tom Ripley, who we would describe as a sociopath if we met him.
A charming
sociopath. And of course it's much easier to represent a sociopath. It's still not easy, but it's much easier to represent a sociopath or a psychopath in literature, because in real life, if a successful sociopath or psychopath moves near us, we don't know that's what they are. Yes. Unless they get caught. So that's part of it as well, is when they get caught, we can actually see how a different kind of mind operates.
Yes.
And I think that we're fascinated and somewhat obsessed by that notion of not being able to see into other people's minds, not knowing what's going through somebody's head, not being able to tell the truth of a person. And I think that psychological element is really important in respect of why it's become such a massive part of the crime fiction genre. And it brings in studies on culture, history, etc., etc. It's nothing new. People have always been fascinated by the criminal and criminality.
Yeah.
And crime fiction itself came into existence in around the middle of the 19th century. And just the interest in public hangings and things like that
Yes.
back there show us that it's not something that we suddenly have become obsessed with, and we're kind of, you know, I don't know, something wrong with us today, but it's always been part of people's interest.
Yes, but now they tell us the story.
Yes.
And you add some psychological elements,
Yes.
so it gets a, I don't know, more tasty soup.
Yes.
Probably.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's there is a mutual relationship between reality and fiction. Always,
Yes.
fiction is based on reality. Nobody writes about something that they really not know. But I wonder how the opposite side, because in crime, I imagine that the narrative created by the creative writing also affected the reality then. Is it true?
Yes, and I think especially today, many criminals take their cues from novels. I mean, we see a criminal will read a novel about a serial killer and so on, and it self-perpetuates. So it means that crimes that are committed are just as dependent on the kind of fantasies created really in creative writing as well. So
Like a copycat?
well, sort of, but also thinking about, because if you're a crime fiction writer, I mean, Patricia Highsmith writes a wonderful book about this called The Blunderer, and he's a crime fiction writer.
Yeah.
Then his wife disappears, and the police see the manuscript where he's told everyone he's going to kill her, but he didn't kill her because it was his fantasy. So he's really didn't act out, but they think that he's acted out this fantasy. So if you read a wonderful crime fiction novel, or you see a series, you find that they're almost like, yes, copycats of people who will then take the clues and the ideas for those actions in reality.
So reality sometimes are even solving some
Yes.
true crimes in reality through fiction?
Yes, yes.
Are there some special case that happened a sort of this in reality?
Well, I think that probably the ones that we know about, because I think when someone is a criminal and they're arrested, and they are not going to tell us that it's based on a crime novel.
No.
But those kinds of those kinds of things come out more obliquely in a case. But it's more. I think I'm more interested in the way that the true crime writing actually echoes the past. So that, for example, the first example of this was the first full-length crime fiction novel, which is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins.
Yes.
And what happened in that is that Wilkie Collins, as the first major crime fiction writer in the UK, obviously there had been Edgar Allan Poe and others before him who wrote short stories, but he was very influenced by a true crime that had happened just a few years before he wrote The Moonstone. And this was in about 1860. And it was a murder at Road House, which is in Wiltshire near Bath. And of course, the readers would have been very aware of the real crime. But in The Moonstone, he almost embellished the crime. So he took some elements of the crime. So people almost see the Moonstone as the real crime and the actual real crime as a story in itself. But what it goes to show, there was a fantastic book written about 10 years ago by Kate Summerscale called The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher. And Mr. Witcher was one of the first detectives in the Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police was only established in 1829, and the detective branch, which was about 8 people, came into existence in 1842. And the public was just as fascinated, in fact more fascinated, by the serialization through newspapers and magazines with the actual crime, the real crime, than they were with the novel that occurred, that Wilkie Collins wrote 2 years after the actual crime. So they blend together in people's imaginations at that time. People were fascinated by criminality.
Okay, so the crime fiction, it's an invention of the modern world. It's something
Yes.
that happened after the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, you said though that the invention of the policeman in 1829 was something that became the public interesting in investigation. So
Yes.
what happened before? It doesn't exist? Or
Oh, I think if you read Shakespeare,
Yeah, I
you
know,
see, you
but,
see.
but yes, it exists, but
yes.
not people that follow.
I think at that time, there was an increase in literacy in the mid 18th century. The interest in Gothic fiction
Yes.
was also very important, and there was a movement in the mid 1800s called sensational fiction, sensation fiction. Wilkie Collins was also very much part of that. And people like Mary Elizabeth Braddon with Lady Audley's Secret, who is a wonderful anti-hero, who's wicked and very, very fantastic. And these were novels that were shocking to the public in the mid 1800s. So it's almost like today, our popular fiction.
Yes.
And those kinds of murder, poisoning, kidnapping, all of those things, bigamy was very big, actually started to be written into books in the mid 1800s. Before then, I think people had presumed, and still do sometimes, that literature and the novel should be about greater things. It should be about goodness. It should be about education and moral goodness. And the Gothic is very important, obviously, as a genre, and sensational fiction together kind of led to crime fiction, because a lot of the texts of around that time, for example, Lady Audley's Secret, features a relative, a rich man who plays private detective.
Yeah.
But they don't call him a private detective because it's just prior to that time. And it was shocking that women would read this stuff. And this is a very interesting point. It was very popular with women. It was supposed to lead women astray.
Yeah, the same as Gothic.
Yes, and
Yeah.
they read with their emotions, not their brain. The difference with that and Gothic is it was domestic.
Yeah.
So it was set in the house, and it was, unlike the Gothic tropes, it has these kind of domestic, homely kind of settings. And that actually led pretty much into crime fiction at that time. Obviously, before that time, before the rise and the invention of the police force, there were very, almost like people were in the pay of the rich. And so in the Moonstone and in the real case of the Road house killing with Mr. Witcher, the policemen were of a lower class, and the families only wanted them to investigate the servants and not the members of the upper class in the family. And so the detective was a very revolutionary figure. The police detective was a very revolutionary figure because it was a case of the worker coming into the home
And also
of the rich.
He can lay down all the borders that's supposed to exist, because he can investigate the lower classes, not the richest one,
Yes.
because the richest one wouldn't able to kill.
No, they were too morally good.
Yeah.
But they did.
Yeah, and how about the human relationship? Because there is a fascination. You said that this is the gender that is it's the bestseller in the world. So there is a sort of fascination for the serial killer. And even in reality, many of them are celebrities.
Yes.
Why?
Yes.
it is a psychological stuff that works in this sort of gender and topics?
Well, that's a question I'm asking myself at the moment because I've just started to write a book on this, and I'm looking at the kind of psychological or psychoanalytic processes of our identification with something evil, something that we would not do, and something other to us, but that we are attracted to at the same time. If you take Ted Bundy, for example, when he was on trial in Florida the second time, the courtroom was full of women of 22, 23 with long dark hair with a parting, and they were all in love with Ted Bundy. They were obsessed with him. They were exactly the kind of look that he would kill.
Wow.
So why? Why do women write to serial killers? Charles Manson had many offers of marriage. What is it? I think maybe for those, it's safety, because they will never just be in the same room as that person, because they know that they're, but also it's like the cliche of every girl wants to change a bad boy.
Yeah.
Taken to extremes.
Yeah, but might be the idea of Nietzsche of being apart. So the Apollonian stuff and the Dionysius one. So this Dionysian force that is silenced by our will all the time still exists.
Yes.
So it's and in fiction it expresses in a safety way.
Yes.
Might be that.
Yes, and in Freud's terms, after Nietzsche, for Freud, it's like we repress everything that is not culturally acceptable, and our sense of guilt and conscience is something we're not born with. Yeah. We develop that. So it is almost like flirting with that which we repress, that we keep outside everyday society. So those people do the things in a psychoanalytic sense that we might want to do ourselves, but we would never do it.
Yeah, it's like you complete yourself with your dark side through literature and fantasy.
Yes, and with true crime, that's why true crime narratives are interesting, because it brings it closer to reality, even though a narrative about somebody can. I mean, there's been quite a few criticisms of this recently, saying that it elevates people who are just horrible murderers, and that is true. That is an argument I can understand. But but what do you do? What do you say to people? That you're not allowed to see this anymore? You can't make television programs. You can't write narratives, memoirs, novels. No, I'm interested in what it is that makes people want to read this stuff, and not necessarily bloodthirsty, because a lot of crime fiction novels are much more bloodthirsty and violent than true crime narratives. I mean, there is a whole other true crime industry that is based on voyeurism and showing photo. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things like, one of the most famous ones is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. That was written in the 1960s, and Mailer's The Executioner's Song, which won the Pulitzer Prize, by the way. So some of those are considered amongst the finest kind of literature as well. But why are we so interested? It's a question that I'm asking, and I think it does come down to this psychological and also the social that we can see in crime fiction, and especially in true crime narrative, everything that happens in the world around us while being safe, because we are in control of the book, or we can turn off the television or whatever. And it allows us to live that in a vicarious way. Yes.
And well, that's all this fantasy, all this fascination also crossed to the TV. You mentioned TV. So now there are many series that works with that, the true crime and crime fiction in general. And which of the series that are now showing, I don't know, in Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, do you recommend it?
Well, one of the most interesting ones is Making a Murderer, which has had 2 seasons now. And it is one of the classic ways that people are using documentary and television, it's Netflix, is to attempt to right a wrong, to question the guilt of, usually American, they're very usually American. And with Making a Murder, a couple of college students just decided to make a documentary in the court in a murder case, and no one really noticed they were there. And it's now become so popular. For example, 20 years ago, people in the offices would meet at the water cooler or for coffee, and they would talk about soap operas or television. Now they talk about Making a Murderer or Mindhunter or these programs, because everyone comes down on different sides. So it gives people a chance to argue about good and evil, morality, injustice. And in Making a Murderer, it's very complicated, and I'm not going to spoil this for people who haven't seen it, but it is an attempt to actually show that these people are in prison for something that they may or may not have done, but the processes were flawed. So it's a real indictment of the American justice system, and it's still going on, and there are appeals which are being affected by the show.
Yeah. And also, I imagine that through those, people learn a lot about the justice and how the system works and questioning.
Absolutely. And so what's happening now, which is fascinating to me, is that cases that are in the media, usually, because there's no book of Making a Murder, it's a television documentary series, are changing the law. In some cases, the podcast Serial, which is the best-selling podcast, or best listened to podcast ever, about a murder case, not changed the law, but it directly influenced the fact that there was an appeal new trial for the person who'd been convicted of a murder directly.
So fiction is affecting reality too.
Yes. And of course, people do argue, that Making a Murderer, Serial, these kind of shows are one-sided.
Yeah.
So you have to then allow the other side, and then you get a very interesting kind of series of debates around justice, around class, again, gender, equality, all of those kinds of things. Another really, really good show is Mindhunter, which is now in production for its second season. And this is based on a book that was written in the 1970s about the FBI and the rise in criminal profiling. And we're all used to, you could watch lots and lots and lots of crime shows on FBI and that sort of thing. But this is the real story of how that happened. And it didn't happen because the FBI decided it was important. It was 2 or 3 people actually going against the kind of, throw them in prison and take away the key, and saying, we need to understand why they do it so that we can attempt to stop those behaviors in future.
Yeah, so it became psychological.
Yes.
So now it's not just the crime, so why they make it, try to go into the criminal mind.
Yes, absolutely. So we can watch Criminal Minds on the television, but Mindhunter is the real story, and they went around interviewing many, many, many murderers and serial killers to try and find things that they had in common, and that was the birth of profiling.
Wow.
And it's very interesting because my students, both on the undergraduate and the MA programs, they're young and they're really, really very clever, but they didn't realize until they start watching these things that this is only the 1970s. It's very recent.
Yes.
And the television series is today, looking back on how that actually evolved. So something that we now take for granted, like profiling.
As many things.
And it's very, very recent.
Oh, yeah. And how about well, because here, well, I think around the world was very fashionable, all the shows of Nordic noir, so the Scandinavian first, but not just the Scandinavian, because Germans also are doing very interesting things. What do you think about this new approach? Because they goes even beyond in a sort of psychological and complex trauma or idea. What do you think about them?
Well, some years ago, I think that Scandinavian noir and Nordic noir is slightly less popular than it was, because I think that sometimes crime fiction is a commercial thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes the market gets flooded by less good authors. But I think that the main, the Wallander series and Henning Mankell, Jo Nesbø, also in France, Fred Vargas, who's excellent. In Ireland, Tana French, who is excellent. And then we have the Scottish, the Tartan Noir with Ian Rankin and Val McDermid. They all use location. A lot of my students are very interested in the idea of location and place.
Yes.
And in the Nordic Noir, you have this cold environment. You have countries who are
safe.
They're safe, but they're high suicide rates. They're considered what the most comfortable place to live. Very, very high standard of living. Very good places to live. But there's also a very problematic undercurrent of depression.
Yes.
Because of the weather.
Yeah, and light.
And the light. So it's either no light or light all the summer. And so they're very interesting. For example, Icelandic noir. Like Trapped. In a country that just doesn't have murder hardly at all. And if you read Scandinavian noir and you go to Scandinavia, you're going to think there's murderers all the time everywhere, and it's not true. It's a very low crime rates, and as you say, they're safe. But again, it's a lovely fantasy. I mean, very interested in looking at things from a psychogeographical perspective. So the psyche, the landscape, the weather, all these become almost characters.
Yeah, part of the psychological trauma.
Yeah. So they're very interesting, and some people choose to set, like Ian Rankin sets his novels in Edinburgh and real places. And there's a pub in Edinburgh where American tourists often go, where Rebus, his detective, drinks, and Ian Rankin drinks in there as well. But they'll go in and they'll ask for Rebus, and the barman might say, "Well, no, Rebus doesn't exist. Ian Rankin's here. No, we're not interested in him. We want Rebus." So they believe the characters are actually real. And I think that actually goes towards real crime as well, because there's a increasing lack of a distinction between them.
Yeah, the reality and fiction. But that's happened always. Thinking about, I don't know, Paris and the Notre Dame, people look at it and look at the Hunchback.
Yes. Which
one never exists. Yes. Or if somebody crossed Sherwood, they were thinking about Robin Hood. And I think this is the power of fantasy and literature creation.
It is, and especially these days with visual representations, because I think when you read, you're using your imagination more, and you have a kind of critical distance. Whereas if you see something on the TV screen or whatever it might be, then it's actually harder to make that distinction.
Yeah. I told at the beginning to the public that we will try to settle conference in Chile for next year.
Yes.
So could you tell them about what we are planning in order that they can join us?
Well, I run a conference every year in Bath Spa in Bath it's called Captivating Criminality, and it's on different crime fiction themes every year. It's become very, very popular. I have delegates from all over the world, and this year I'm taking it to Italy, to Pescara. It's going abroad for the first time. We have been really, really thrilled how many people have been interested to come there. So that's in June. So what I thought would be really, really good would be to have a conference here around the same time next year, March next year, because I have a fascination with Latin American crime fiction, but there isn't very much of it. And part of having the conference here would be to draw attention for the people of Chile, the people of Latin America, and also bring in delegates that I have from all over the world, Australia, America, Britain, Europe, to here to think about crime fiction in this setting.
Yeah, it would be lovely
as well.
We are very happy to be the guest, and
Yes.
we invite all the people to
Yes.
join us.
So,
And we promise to bring some great authors.
yes, so people can come like in a traditional academic conference, and they can propose a paper, and then they can be on a panel. But also we're happy for people to just come and sit and listen and create a few days of just concentration on crime fiction, true crime, history, media, television, all of these things to do with crime and crime fiction.
Oh, that will be great.
I
hope
so,
people
yes.
join us. So they're all invited to next year for the symposium here in Chile. So next March 2nd or 3rd week
Yes.
will be Santiago de Chile Crime Fiction Seminar. That's it. So los esperamos a todos en marzo, segunda o tercera semana, junto a Fiona Peters y a algunos autores internacionales, y a todos los que quieran establecer ponencia, todas bienvenidas. Vamos a ver quiénes califican e incluso vamos a ver que los que sean las mejores ponencias que luego puedan ir a exponer a la Universidad de Bath.
Thank you very much.